So, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. What you were talking about in terms of snow, it really reminded me, part of my PhD dissertation was to write about and research, of course, the different Orientalists. So, just an idea. The whole issue about stereotypical images about Islam, and of course, it was really about Muslims in the beginning, and that's how they learned about Islam. But one or a couple of things to say here. Number one is that a lot of that information was coming from the different, uh, adventurers. They would go to the Muslim countries and actually talk about their experience. And of course, they were writing that information, the adventure, and all of that. And that's why about Muslim women, I guess it was rather too ambiguous for them because they didn't really have a personal relationship with Muslim women. So they would create their own adventure of, well, what is behind this veil? What is behind these closed doors? So they would put their and make up their own fascination and their own fantasy of some harems behind these closed doors. This is what the harems are dressed in. This is what they look like. And they would create their own, of course, imagination. And same thing when we're talking about the different writings in where not all of it was necessarily coming from an educated or at least coming from an educated, let's say, study, but most of it was actually coming from those kind of adventures. And of course, the stereotypical images would be passed down from this rahala or this person that was migrating or traveling, and then they would say their experiences. But one of those experiences, I would say, not one, but it was a couple that stood out. I can't remember right now some of those names, but they were writing uh, how when they were traveling in the desert to go to certain countries, and just in the middle of the desert, they were fascinated with the sound of no sound, with the sound of silence, that it almost felt like your ears, you were doubting whether there was any sound at all, or whether your ears were picking up any sound, or whether your ears were functioning at all, because the desert was the only place where they would hear there was no sound. It was literally not the sound of any air, not the sound of trees, water. There was no sound whatsoever. And it's quite interesting and interests me to see that the people in the Gulf, when they want to go on a trip, they would actually go on field trips to the desert. And that, I couldn't understand why anybody would go to the desert for a field trip, because it would be, to us, at least Palestinians, and I guess, we would actually go to places that would have greenery. You would see a green area, you would want to live close to the greenery and all of that, but that's not necessarily what everyone likes. And I guess, would go to the Gulf. No, they would take these these times off just to go to the desert, and that's where they would consider that that's where they would get their relief, in where there's no sound, there's no life, there's basically just a time for relaxation. And that connects me with, right now, there's this during our times, there's this scholar. Let me show you his picture. Okay. And this scholar is probably right now one of the most scholarly scholars right there. And he was talking about how, as a child, he was, I guess, living in Shanqit, and that city of Shanqit was in Mauritania, and how they didn't really have much. In fact, they had nothing to play with, and it was basically just an empty space. It was a desert area, and you had basically nothing to do, and what you would find entertaining was only to study. So it was to memorize poetry, memorize Quran, memorize the different books, because you really had nothing to do. That was the only thing that you could entertain you. And because you had nothing to do, you only found entertainment in seeking ilm. And that's why, we are talking about their memory, and you're talking about scholars that are, I would say, raised based on the system of the scholars in, let's say, in the ancient, or at least the olden times. They are the only ones in Mauritania that are actually still maintaining the same system of hifz, the same system of memorization that was basically practiced during the times of Bukhari, Muslim, and those scholars back then. And this area is basically right there in where Shanqit, let's look at it, right? Shanqit and Mauritania, right? Mauritania. Let's get an idea where that is, right? Let's see. And we're going to go to images. So this is what he's talking about. You had the desert, you had nothing else, and that was it. Let's see. This is it.
They're
So
mostly Maliki, right?
they are Maliki,
Yeah.
100% Maliki, Noura. Good job, good job. Yes, they are Maliki, 100% Maliki. And this is Nawakshot right there. But of course, they're actually not in Nawakshot, they're in Shanqit. So basically, all you had was basically this desert looking like places. So that's how they would memorize, that's how they would learn. It was just using the old system to memorize. I actually wanted to go there, but my husband thought it was going to be too simple, too primitive, so not necessarily the best choice, at least what he considered, not what I considered. I didn't have a problem with it, but just an idea. This is how they would memorize. They would just basically have these places, and even Iddadu himself, he was actually saying that that his mother, even though he was only 5 years old, but he had to, in order to go to sleep, he had to actually give uh, i'rab, which is basically lugha arabiya, in where he had to break down grammar and pretty much, do the grammar study before he went to sleep, and even while he was awake, they had nothing to do but actually sit and memorize and study, and that was basically their place of entertainment. All right, so we're just gonna go over in where what we were supposed to be doing. It was basically Tafsir al-Qurtubi. So we did talk about this page, okay, with, of course, talk about this page and do the tafsir قفينا على أثرهم بعيسى ابن مريم, and we went in details with this page, and we also did this page and completed this page, but we still didn't do tafsir al-Qurtubi over, and of course, for this page and that page, but hopefully inshallah we'll be doing it today. All right, so here we go. This is basically ayah, and let's look at it. Basically ayahs 46. Let's start with that, and we're just see what al-Qurtubi is saying in relationship to these ayat. Let's see it right there, because it's important, of course, for us to learn, going back to the tafsir and not necessarily a general tafsir. All right, so here we go. قفينا على أثرهم بعيسى ابن مريم, and here he says that he made Isa يقفو أثرهم. Now I want you to look at the word يقفو, because the word right there in where قفينا, and of course in Lugha Arabiya, when we look at the root is قافية, and the word قافية is to take steps. So that's basically what he was, I guess, emphasizing and indicating, that they were taking the steps of course, the steps, the different traces for the different prophets that had aslamu. Aslamu actually means one. When you put that alif right before it, so when we say asbahu, aslamu, or asbaha, aslama, amsa, adha, that actually means they entered during that time period. Or when we say aslama, he entered Islam. Okay, when we say aslamu, it can mean to enter the place, and it can also mean to embrace it. So, it's just a different way, I guess, of viewing it right there. So aslamu, all the different prophets had basically aslamu. Does it mean to basically embrace Islam, or does it mean to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Basically means both. So to submit and also to embrace Islam. Basically means the same thing. مصدقا لما بين يديه. And of course, what Prophet Isa alayhi salam, the word مصدقا actually comes from the root صدقة. The root صدقة actually means to believe, or to say the truth. And when we're talking about sadaqah, to believe, to say the truth, and when you're breaking that down, and where, of course, musaddiqan, and in that situation, this is talking about right there in where what it was doing, in where it was right there confirming. So it comes from the same root, in where to confirm. Of course, in English, English conjugation is completely different than Arabic. So just keep that in mind. So you will see that we're using different words. In Lugha Arabiya, no. صدق يصدق تصديقا. All right. This is in Lugha Arabiya, in where there's a certain conjugation, there's a certain relationship between, of course, the words and how they're conjugated, and the etymology for it, how you would bring about these additions, and how they were to go back to the same idea. All right. لما بين يديه, we also said right there, so مصدقا لما بين يديه, speaking about the Torah, that it was basically confirming what he had come with in terms of revelation, in terms of course, the different information that he had basically wanted the Bani Israel to abide by. And certainly Prophet Isa alayhi salam didn't necessarily come with a new legislature. He was basically wanting them to follow the Torah itself. And certainly Prophet Isa alayhi salam was coming to Bani Israel, but Bani Israel, of course, accused the mother of Virgin Mary of actually getting Prophet Isa alayhi salam outside of wedlock, and therefore considering that he is nothing but an evil spirit. And certainly even the other prophets, of course, they would find each and every single prophet, they would basically want to find a reason to deny that prophet and to not submit to what they were sent with in terms of revelation. So they would make up a reason. Each and every single prophet, they had rejected him or rejected what he had come with in a different way. And certainly, of course, the Huda and the Nur, this is, we mentioned before, that in the Torah and even in the Injeel, having il-Huda and the Nur. We went in details in terms of il-Huda to mean guidance, and certainly all of it was actually coming to confirm the same revelation that was sent before. Let's continue right there. Musaddiqan, and of course, who was that going to be? A maw'idha lil-muttaqin, who was going to be seeing the guidance, who was going to be seeing the light, who was going to be seeing and hearing the words of maw'idha, hearing the good words and applying it. Well, it was going to be al-muttaqin. Who's al-muttaqi? We said al-muttaqi is basically a certain level of faith in where when the person is living, let's call it the spiritual elevation, and certainly keeping away from the different spiritual contaminations. In other words, keeping distance from all of those spiritual contaminations, in where sin, of course, they're basically creating some form of an armor, and that's where the word taqiyya comes from, in where you're protecting yourself. Protecting themselves from what? Well, they're protecting themselves from the different contaminations, from the different spiritual denouncers. So that's why they're called muttaqin. So that's basically right there in where hadiyan wa wa'adhan lil muttaqin. And therefore, the person that's not practicing taqwa, they won't be capable of, I guess, getting the guidance, finding the light, or even being able to hear or repeat or even live and embrace the words of that revelation. So this is, just keep those things, those three in mind. We went in details with that, so I'm just going over some of it. وَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. So you could see in where Al-A'mash and Hamza, they basically had read it as وَلْيَحْكُمْ, not وَلْيَحْكُمْ. It's a different qira'ah. The difference between, sorry about that, but just the difference between وَلِيَحْكُمْ, this qira'ah, and the other qira'ah, in where وَلِيَحْكُمْ, which is the other qira'ah with the kasra, in where what that would mean, in where it is basically revealed in order for the people of Ahlul Injeel to rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. So it was, in other words, it's giving a reason here. It's laying out the reason for it. It's basically laying out, of course, the analogy to why Injeel was sent down anyways, or at least why it was revealed, or why Prophet Isa alayhi salam was teaching them those teachings. The other scholars had, or at least the other variant readers, they basically read it as وَلْيَحْكُمْ, as an imperative verb. We talked about that, but just wanted you to see it right there in where, what does that really mean? آتَيْنَاهُ الْإِنْجِيلِ, and right there, آتَيْنَاهُ الْإِنْجِيلِ, and of course, certainly he said, فَلَا يَجُوزُ الْوَقْفُ وَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بما أنزل الله فيه ومن لم يحكم بما أنزل الله فأولئك هم الفاسقون. Okay, let's continue right there, and where and of course he said وقيل هذا أمر للنصارى الآن بالإيمان بمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم فإن في الإنجيل وجوب الإيمان به والنسخ إنما يتصور في الفروع لا في الأصول. All right, what is he basically saying? He said, well, what this means and what this order, in other words, the imperative verb here, and where what it's saying is that let them rule by what, let the people of Ahlul Injil basically rule by what was revealed in the Injil. But some scholars, according to what Al-Qurtubi is saying, in where some scholars had said, well, this is referring not to necessarily legislature per se, but this was referring to embracing the prophecy about the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling them, in where rule and basically embrace what was revealed onto you in the Injil in regards to the prophecy for the about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is not necessarily in here that necessarily talking to them. لا يتصور إنما يتصور في الفروع لا في الأصول. So this is not saying and asking the Christians to basically rule, meaning to embrace or even judge based on what was in the Injil in terms of perhaps different different legislatures, because the Quran had abrogated all the legislatures that were revealed or at least taught in the Injil or taught in the Torah. So it would make no sense to actually think that the Quran was telling the people of the people of Ahlul Injil, the Christians that is, it makes no sense to see that the Quran was telling them to go back to the Injil and therefore leave the Quran, because the Quran was actually the final and the last revelation. Now, I want you to keep this one in mind, because today, and especially during our times where people's Lugha Arabiya is basically weakened, and certainly people are taking the words out of context, and then they would confuse the different interpretations. And certainly you could see in where putting it within the context in where what this ayah was telling them is not to go and rule by the Injeel, but it was actually telling them to rule by the Injeel, to meaning to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the different prophecies that had foretold about the Prophet ﷺ. All right, let's see. And with the, of course, you could see we're going really fast because we're just going over the notes and making sure that we're seeing these notes and helping us, of course, relate to what we had said and said before in the previous classes. أنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه من الكتاب ومهيمنا عليه. Let's see. In where أنزلنا إليك الكتاب, he said the discourse is basically directed to the Prophet ﷺ. In where here it says أنزلنا إليك, we had revealed upon you, and of course the pronoun you right there is really referring to Muhammad ﷺ, in where this is not talking to the reader, but this is talking to the Prophet ﷺ himself. And you could see that the Prophet ﷺ was reciting the Quran in the exact pronoun, in the exact way that it was recited, and not changing it, that they had told me that it was revealed onto me. Nope, he was reciting exactly the way that Jibreel alayhi salam was directing the words. The Prophet ﷺ would repeat it, and he would just read it as he was hearing it and as he was told to basically recite it as. So right there, أنزلنا إليك الكتاب. So therefore, when you're looking at al-kitab, what you're seeing, al-kitab. And of course, when you're looking at the word al-kitab, is this speaking about a particular book? Is this speaking about just generally the different books? No, this is referring to a particular book, and that is Al-Quran. Remember, there are two kinds of al. There's al-istighraqiyya and there is al-ahdiyya. Let's write that down so we could remember it. So what's the difference between for the al-istighraqiyya? I'm going to write that down, right? Al-istighraqiyya, and the other one is al-ahdiyya. What's the difference? Al-ahdiyya would actually be a specifying al. Al-istighraqiyya would be an inclusive al. Okay, so when we're talking about al-istighraqiyya, and this is talking about all the books. If we're talking about a specifying one, it's talking about one specific book, or whatever that noun is relating to. Here it's relating to a book, so therefore it's one specific item. It's not many items, it's actually one specific item. So therefore al-kitab, he's basically saying it's ahdiya. It's basically right there talking about a specific item. It's basically talking about and referring to the Quran, period. Okay, let's see. And here when it's talking about أنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق, we had revealed upon you. So إليك, and we're directly speaking to the Prophet ﷺ, directly one-to-one, بالحق. And of course, the letter ba is basically right there to mean with, and just the letter ba. Of course, just imagine this one in Lugha Arabiya, it's just one letter. In English, it's going to be a whole word, with. All right, so bil haqq, with truth. In other words, well, what is al haqq? What is the truth referring to? He said, well, bil amr al haqq, with the matters of truth, and certainly with the different revelations of truth. Okay, مصدقا لما بين يديه أي من جنس الكتب. Okay, so what is he saying right now? مصدقا, where was it? أنزلنا إليك الكتاب مصدقا لما بين يديه من الكتاب. So this kitab right there is an inclusive one, but this kitab is a specific one. Let's do it again. Should we do it again? Okay, here we go. What does it say anyways? How did you get there? So musaddiqan is actually meaning to confirm what was revealed bayna yaday, and the word bayna yaday right there, this is a metaphor. And yes, it's let's say a metaphor, but in a compound word. So it becomes more of an idiom, type of an idiom, in where when you say bayna yaday, this, it becomes, well, is this to mean in the future, or what is really between the hands of a person? This is a literal translation. So it's not bayna yaday with what is in between his hands or what is in front of you. But bayna yaday could also mean what had passed. So that's why when you talk about musaddiqan, in where the book that was revealed, that was the Quran, was confirming. So this one is, sorry, no, I should have actually done a better job with this. Okay, let's do it. We're gonna do a better job. Here we go. So this one was a specifying one, and it was confirming what was basically preceding him. So this is bayna yaday, what was preceding him, min al-kitab, basically all the different books. Yes, this kitab is basically one book. The word kitab is one book, but lima bayna yadayhi min al-kitab, so any book that was revealed before him. We're talking about any holy books, any revelations, okay? And where what the different books were really revealing is basically, if it is a revelation, then it was going to be confirming exactly what was revealed in truth in terms of the Quran itself. Let's continue right there. Muhaiminan alayh. Now, look at the word muhaiminan for a little bit. We're just going to erase all of these and just kind of see the word muhaiminan alayh. So if the Quran was muhaiminan, how do we understand that? So let's say muhaiminan, in where is it superior? Is it in where right there, aliyan, murtafi'an? Does that mean it's superior? Does it mean it's beyond? In where, of course, are we talking about also some form of tafdeel? What's the difference? What does that mean? So are we talking about some form of preference here, that the Quran was preferred over the different revelations? Or is this talking about that it was superior to the other revelations and all of that? Now you could see different scholars actually relating to how do we understand these books? Or is it possible that you can consider one revelation as necessarily better, but if you were to say that one revelation was better, that would also entail that the other revelation was worse? Is that what you're going to be saying? Well, the answer is no. It's all basically right there, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only reveal words of good, words of khair. So this is not to necessarily say that the Quran was better, therefore the other ones are worse. So to use this dichotomy, I guess, is a dangerous one. And definitely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that the Torah contained huda and nur. Therefore, to describe the Torah as somehow worse than the Quran or somehow not as good, etc., of course, is basically playing that dichotomy, the words of dichotomy. And certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically telling us not to use this dichotomy, and that many times it can make us go into, of course, wording things in the wrong way. So at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us muhaiminan alayh, that it was, we're talking about perhaps muhaiminan to complete it, muhaiminan to perhaps even be superior because it basically was the last revelation, or was it even better because it contained the final revelation? So now you could see in where does it have, of course, even more thawab and certainly more deeds if the person was following the Quran and rather than the Torah. Well, during that time, that was the revelation that everyone was supposed to be following. And later, Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the final revelation as the Quran, and that's why it was muhaiminan alay. It was then basically going beyond, it was basically completing, it was basically right there, bringing about the final revelation. Let's see. In where Sa'id ibn Jubair, he basically, now Sa'id ibn Jubair was one main scholar. He was killed by al-Hajjaj 95 year Hijriya. Anyways, he basically said, well, what the word muhaiminan means, he said it basically, I've got an evidence in where Ibn Abbas, he said, mu'tamanan alay. Well, there's a difference because the ones before, they basically said muhaymin actually means to be superior, but Ibn Abbas and Sa'id ibn Jubair, basically following Ibn Abbas, they said no, mu'tamanan alay, in where it is to bring about a confirmation, some form of mu'tamanan, in where it is to bring about not only a confirmation, but bringing in, let's say that continuing the chain of truth. So mu'tamanan alay, in where the Torah was basically prophesying what was in the Quran, and the Quran was basically confirming the huda and the nur that was revealed in the Torah. The Quran was also doing the same, in where they're basically right there confirming the roles of one another. All right. So here he said, مؤتمنا على ما قبله من الكتب. What is al-i'timan? Al-i'timan is basically to bring trust. So right there, when we talk about bringing trust, I could only find an equivalent word to confirm, to affirm as well, some of what was revealed between these two books, and therefore he said al-muhaymin is basically to mean the one that is trusted. So in other words, these two books were confirming and basically affirming that the truth in between these two revelations. Let's say in where al-Mubarrid, who's actually, I wish I can right now, I don't want to give it off track. We'll talk about al-Mubarrid in the future, inshallah. And certainly, of course, he basically, I guess, had some support for that, in where he said it basically comes from that, the root mu'aymin. So it's not necessarily muhaymin. He said it actually, that ha is originally in Lugha Arabiya as an hamza. Now that one's really weird, right? That Lugha Arabiya, and how the etymology goes back. So in Mubarrid, who's actually a great scholar in Lugha Arabiya, maybe should we just look him up a little bit? Just a little bit, not too far, right? We don't want to go too far. Okay, I'm going to get that one and just to see why and how did he get that far, right? Let's go back and actually see what he was saying and who is this person, right? Who is this person that is talking in this way? And let's see right there, and we're gonna go back to it. Where is it? Oh no, what did I do? Here we go. Okay, so let's see who al-Mubarrid is. You could see I was looking into al-Mubarrid. Okay, so one thing, you could see he died 898 AD. Remember what I like about Wikipedia? Sometimes I know it's not a credible resource, but I love the fact that they would put those dates right there that you can't really find in other I guess other books. Let's see al-Mubarrid right there, in where he would, who's that? Well, remember our favorite, al-Dhahabi in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. And he was saying, al-Mubarrid is basically Imam al-Nahu. What does it mean that he's Imam al-Nahu? What that means, in where he is the main teacher, kind of talking about that person like he's the top teachers for Nahu, for Arabic grammar. He was Azdi, Basri, and he was Nahawi. Okay, Azdi was, I guess, from the tribes of Al-Azd and from Al-Basra, in other words, from Al-Iraq, and certainly he was a scholar of Nahu, and he was akhbari, historian. Al-Akhbari is a historian, and certainly the book Al-Kamil, I was going over Al-Kamil. Maybe I can let you see that book Al-Kamil. Okay, الكامل الكامل في النحو. Okay, and في النحو والصرف. Just kind of, oh, oops, I went to the wrong book. Oh dear. All right, that's all right. But الكامل في النحو, and of course, it was one of those books that I would say is really revealing this exceptional intelligence that in where how he would basically break down. Let's look at El Kamil right there. This is the book El Kamil. So not too big, but of course, extremely intelligent in how he was breaking down those words. In where, of course, he was a main scholar in where imaman, allama, jamilan, wasiman. It's really funny how sometimes the scholars, other scholars would basically, I guess, comment on their appearance, that he was a handsome man. Okay, he was allama. He was basically a polymath. And certainly mufawwahan, in where he was very eloquent, and he was صاحب نوادر وطرف, in where he was also funny. And sometimes he would say a lot of these stories, and he was a very funny character. That's really interesting, because not all scholars are funny. But to actually talk about him as handsome and funny, well, that's a character that girls would definitely want to find and want to get married to. So yeah, not all scholars were necessarily like that, right, ladies? All right, let's see. إن where كان ثعلب أعلم باللغة وبنفس النحو من المبرد. So basically, Thalib was basically a different scholar, said, well, basically had more ilm, but in Mubarrid basically was a scholar in Nahu. Now, it's important to understand that in Lugha Arabiya, of course, there's a difference between the knowledge, or at least the science of Nahu, and between Sarf, all right? So, and even Balagha. Those are different fields. So when we're talking about Nahu, we're talking about the grammar. We're talking about the structure for the Arabic. When we're talking about Sarf, we're talking about the conjugation. We're talking about, I guess, understanding the etymology for the words, the structure, the conjugation, and how those words are basically coming from one another. In other words, the root, and how they would basically build onto that root, which is, jamid, mushtaq, and all of that stuff. Now, the balagha is a different field, because al-balagha, let me write those down, right? Let's write those down. In where we said that there is a nahu, there is a sarf, and there is al-balagha. Okay, al-balagha would more relate to the areas in where we're studying eloquence. In other words, we're kind of, well, in English, it's what is al-balagha in English called? I can't remember right now. But we're studying, of course, in a sarf, we're studying phonics. In nahu, we're studying grammar. In al-balagha, we're basically studying, I guess, the eloquence in it, and what we could see, and where the words, the structure themselves, and what some hidden meanings you would find in al-balagha. And certainly, of course, when we're studying balagha, then certainly you're going to be studying something else, which basically is going deeper, in where you're studying also poetry. Now, that one is a different world. We're not going to go into that, all right, but just an idea. Okay, let's see. You could see that. So we're talking about in where مات المبرد. Oh, well, certainly. Let's see. سنة 86 و200. So 286 year Hijriya. So this is just an idea. And just when we're speaking about dying at that time, it's important to keep in mind that Lugha Arabiya and poetry it actually ended during the time. So we're talking about poetry. We're speaking about the most eloquent lugha arabiya that was ever told was dated up until the year 205 year Hijriya. 205 year Hijriya. Why 205 year Hijriya? Because that's the year that Shafi'i died in. All right. So not every single poetry we would necessarily use as, or even words and talking about the etymology and all of that. Not necessarily that anybody that basically speaks the Arabiya, we would basically consider, well, look, here's a person that speaks Arabic and let's use them as a reference. No, the referencing in Arabiya, whether we're speaking about poetry or whether we're speaking about words, perhaps proverbs, etc., that would basically have to be something that was before the year 205 Hijriya, because that's the year Shafi'i dies in, and it was said that Shafi'i was basically the last one that we had records for speaking in the best and most eloquent Lugha Arabiya, and certainly we're talking about the latest, in other words, the last one. But before that, whether you had al-mu'allaqat, basically those pieces of poetry that were even hung in the Kaaba. All right, so let's see. Let's go back to him. In where he said, well, the etymology, when he says asluhu, which is talking about the origin for that word, in other words, the etymology, he said, il-muhaymin actually goes back in where it's actually mu'aymin. Now this one is really rather interesting. So what is it? In Lugha Arabiya, it's important to keep in mind. You see, when you talk to a person that speaks Lugha Arabiya, let's say you're talking to a person that is coming from perhaps we can use the word qala in order to see what we're talking about. Okay, so here we go. Let's use the word qala. Okay, so qala, you could say that in some cultures, or in some, at least some Arab, they might actually flip the qa into an a and say ala. You would see others, they would say gala. You would see others ghala. And you would see others qala. You would see others kala. Well, wait a minute. What is it? So the Quran was sent in Lughat Quraysh. I want you to keep that one in mind. The Quran was sent in Lughat Quraysh, and the way that other nations might actually, or I don't want to say nations, maybe other tribes might actually read it as in where, is it gala, is it ghala? It's, as what I had said it, in where flipping the qa into an a, or flipping the qa into a gha, or flipping the qa into a ga, all of that. Of course, those were Arabic words anyways. So there were Arabic tribes that were speaking in that way, and it stayed. So when you might find some tribes speaking in the way where they were saying ghala instead of qala, and you might say, well, that's wrong Arabic. No, it's not wrong Arabic. But the only maintained language to mean, well, at least let's say the only maintained, at least phonics, the only maintained structure that we would know of is really Lughat Quraysh. Why? Well, because when we say lugha, this is not talking about language, but this is actually talking about the structure. We're talking about right there, the etymology, the only one that we know that basically maintained one, the sound of it, because we have tajweed, and the tajweed was basically based off the language, or at least the phonics, and even the structure, and even, of course, the accent of Quraysh, but not the other accents. The other accents, we didn't really have any, let's say, referencing that maintained that language. So you might have a language, maybe qala is, let's use a different word and actually see what would sound like. All right, let's look at Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay. Now, Bismillah, you had some tribes actually flip the scene into a ta. Every time there's a scene, they'll make it into a ta. So, Bitmillah. And you'll
Wow,
say that
that sounds weird.
it sounds weird. It sounds weird. But that was a certain accent that they would speak in. And until the time of today, you will have, certain nations that might actually speak in that way. The one that is probably the most common is basically called al-kashkasha. What is that? It's basically flipping the kaf into a cha. So what does that mean? Let's say
Oh yeah,
kuli
like the Khaliji, right?
like
Or they say like
yeah,
instead of
well, some
long X,
Khaliji, because
long
some
X.
Khaliji, they would actually flip the jim into a ya instead of for example, Jumu'ah, they'll say yum'ah instead of fajr, fayr. All right. And you'll have others that know fagr, in where they'll flip the jim into a ga. And same thing when we're talking about the kaf right there. In some cultures or some accents, they'll flip it into a cha. So instead of kuli bismi rabbiki, chuli or chili bismi rabbichi. That's a completely different. Bismi Rabbiki. It was flipped into the kaf. Let's look at it. Chili, Bismi Rabbuchi. Okay, now that sounds really different. And just a just a funny thing, in where my uncle, I have an uncle that's married to an American sister, and when she went to Palestine, in Palestine, we do have certain villages and certain cities that actually speak in Il Kashkasha. So they'll flip it into a cha. Basically, every time there's a cha, there's a ka, they'll flip it into a cha. And she learned the dialect that I speak in, which basically doesn't flip it. So when she went to, I guess, a restaurant to eat, the lady was speaking in this accent. She said, "What is wrong with her? Why is she speaking like that? Can't she speak Arabic?" Not knowing that there are actually different dialects in where it's flipping certain letters and the sound would be different. All right. And just an idea. So, coming from that idea, in where, of course, mu'aymin, in where muhaymin, he said it's actually originally mu'aymin. And therefore, I would say confirming in where what Ibn Abbas and Sa'id ibn Jubair had said, in where what it really is, in where mu'aymin, in other words, it's to confirm and not necessarily to be superior or in any way to bring about any form of preference, but this is basically talking about mu'ayminan alayh, in where it's confirming what was revealed in it. And right there, kana aminan. Remember Al-Jawhari, the guy that basically wrote in Nahu as well, and ended up going into some form of mental illness and basically jumped off and thought that he could fly. So let's say, and he said, "Amana ghayrahu min al-khawf," in where fahuwa mu'min. Okay, well, this one, of course. So basically, he said, wanting to confirm in where what it is, in where how did he go back to it, in where he said it's actually mu'ayminan. This one is really rather beautifully interesting. Okay, really beautifully interesting. Let's see, there is another qira'ah, muhaymanan, not muhayminan, muhaymanan. So let's look into the Quran, where this Quran that I have in front of you is basically رواية حفص عن عاصم. What does it mean, رواية حفص عن عاصم? Let me just write it down so you would remember that one. رواية حفص عن عاصم. Okay, so we're doing it based on رواية حفص عن عاصم, but that wasn't the only variant قراءة. And there were قراءات that basically had been recited by the Prophet ﷺ, and you had chain of narration, basically going back to all of those basically qira'at, and we're completing it all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. But the differences aren't that many. So if a person probably had, let's say, an ijaza in one qira'ah, all right, to get the other qira'at is going to be basically easy to get, because the other qira'at, the variants are basically going to be not too many, but they're going to be in different places. But it's definitely ilm that would definitely be a sharaf to know. All right, what we're doing is Duet Hafs an Asim, and that was probably the most common, but that's not necessarily the one that all would necessarily recite on. So you got probably, my favorite is Qira'at Warsh, but I don't really know Qira'at Warsh, but I'm really in love with Riwayat Warsh. Okay, let's continue. Muhayminan alayh, he said, well, there's another Qira'ah, Muhaymanan alayh. Well, just by flipping or changing from a muhaymin, from a kasra to a fatha, it was going to be basically giving me a different meaning, is it? So here, Mujahid, and of course, you're saying Ibn Muhaysin. Okay, they were saying, well, there's another qira'ah that supports basically this etymology that they had basically come with, which basically is mu'ayminan alay. They basically said, well, we've got another qira'ah in where muhaymanan is to also mean in where confirming what is in the Quran. So here we go. There's that one. فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ. In where here basically said when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ, in where it is an imperative verb, because حَكَمَ is in the past, أحكم is an imperative verb, فعل أمر, right there, where basically tell them فَحْكُم. And of course, let's look at this one right there, just go back to it, in where when you're looking at this fat right there. Okay, here we go. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, we had revealed the book onto you, where it's confirming what was revealed previously onto the other books and confirming what was revealed, in other words, mu'tamanan alay, then therefore, here we go, there's a semicolon, then therefore, this is what that fat would basically entail. This fat, most of the times you would have before the fat a semicolon, because it would basically tell me, then therefore, once you basically know this premise right there, then therefore, this is what this entails. Okay, so this would make it as well, this is what entails, therefore, here's what you need to do. فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ. So therefore, this is right there, an imperative verb. So judge and rule between them, بينهم, between them, whenever there's a dispute or even you're in a position of governance, then you have to rule amongst them by what was revealed on or what was revealed onto you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, let's continue right there. فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ. And he says, يُوجِبُ الْحُكْم. What does that mean? In other words, in Lugha Arabiya, there's, of course, in al-usul, we would say, al-amr yufidu al-wujub. What does that mean? Al-amr yufidu al-wujub. What does that mean? So whenever we would have an imperative verb basically means that this is supposed to be a commandment. Okay, it's basically commanding me, commandment. Okay, whatever. It's basically giving me a commandment in where, of course, unless there was something, and of course, another qarina, تصرفه عن, let's say, from عن الوجوب. Okay, so what does that mean? Not every time that you would see an imperative verb that you would say, that's it, that means this is an obligation, we have to do it. No, if there is another word or another sign or another indication that basically took the word from being an imperative, an order, from an imperative verb into pretty much taking it into a less degree, and where it became mubah, it became permissible, perhaps it became recommended, then in that situation, that would be an indication. So we would look at the whole sentence and not only say, okay, that's it. If got an imperative verb, that's it. That means it's in order. And then, of course, we're going to be misunderstanding law Arabiya. Okay. فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ. He said that there is no qarina. Therefore, this is to basically confirm that it is obligatory when we want to rule that we would rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. In other words, what? If you were basically asked to be a jury duty, all right, or a judge or a lawyer, you would basically have to rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can't say, well, I'm going to be ruling based on their rules, and that's why I'm here. You would have to rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this ayah is really straightforward. I was called for jury duty 4 times, everybody. I have no idea why they're picking on me. Okay, 4 times. Wallahi al-azim, 4 times. All right, let's see. And of course, where some had said, well, no, this isn't necessarily imperative, and where it was giving in an obligation to rule by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, you have no choice. They come, you got to rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But other scholars, they said that no, it is basically abrogated, and it was giving him التخيير. What is it, takhyir? In other words, the option to rule or to turn them away. In other words, do I have to be a judge and actually sit and rule by them? Or is it that I've got an option to basically not rule at all? In other words, not judge amongst them, and basically say, sorry, but we're not available to judge in your case, or perhaps judge and say, well, this is the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is what you have to do. فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ أَوْ أَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ. All right. So basically, where did they why did they say that? Well, it's not necessarily imperative. And how did they basically go out from saying, well, we've got a direct word that is giving me here an imperative verb? How did we go from making it obligatory to basically making it optional? So basically this ayah right there, فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ أَوْ أَعْرِضْ عَنْهُم, in where فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُم means rule between them or turn away from them. أعرض عنهم, turn away. In where in Surah al-Maida, again, that was just a couple ayat before it, in where أو أعرض عنهم. So they said, well, basically these two, in where فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُم بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ or أعرض عنهم. So therefore, they said this wasn't necessarily an imperative verb to mean a commandment, but there was, let's say there was a qarina, an indication or another, I guess, context in where it was taking down or taking and removing the imperative verb from meaning an obligation to meaning, I guess, giving us al-ibaha. Al-ibaha to mean giving you the option to do or to leave, or basically not to do. In other words, it's basically giving you the permission to do or not do. In other words, it's not necessarily obligatory. All right, let's continue. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُم, and don't follow their whims. Let's see, where is that? Right there. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُم عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. لا تتبع أهواءهم أي لا تعمل بأهوائهم ومرادهم. In other words, the word لا تعمل, in other words, don't implement their whims and even what they're pressuring you to do, because لا تترك الحكم بما بين الله تعالى من القرآن من بيان الحق وبيان الأحكام. In other words, don't let go and don't of course, reconsider. That is, don't let go what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically clarified upon you from the different rulings, whether we're talking about rulings or even the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed in truth upon you. Don't let go of it. In other words, you will find certain pressures. But let's see right there. So what is al-ahwa? Al-ahwa, let's look at it right there. When you're talking about ahwa, al-ahwa is basically the plural, it's a plural for the singular word hawa. And of course, the word hawa basically is what you desire, what you love. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically right there. نهاه أن يتبعهم فيما يريدونه. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically forbidding and instructing the Prophet ﷺ to not follow them with whatever they wanted. In other words, they were basically, and there was a story. All right, really rather interesting. It wasn't just the Yahud, but different culture, different nations, or let's say different tribes, were coming to the Prophet ﷺ, and I would say testing his commitment. And the Yahud, they basically wanted, of course, the Prophet ﷺ to change certain criminal law rulings, but there was one that was really rather interesting when the Ta'if, they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they saw, and they were capable of realizing that the Prophet ﷺ's, of course, power was right now growing. So they went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, we're willing to become Muslim. But here's just an idea. If Ta'if was considered of, I guess, one, there was water supply there, so it basically was cooler, and certainly because of the water supply, they basically grew lots of grapes. And from the grapes, they made a lot of alcohol. So that was something that was bringing in a good amount of money, of course, and income, good amount of revenue. And of course, if you're talking about an area where it was more, where even the people of Quraysh, different parts of the Arabian Peninsula would actually go vacationing to Ta'if. Why? Well, because it was a place where, hey, it was a cool weather, it had the water supply, it was basically having also of course, the drinking there. So in other words, you really had bars there. And also there was something else that was coming with it. It was right there, prostitution. Ironically, yes, it was an area, of course, if it was coming in for tourism, you had prostitution, you had alcohol, and you had a good, nice weather. So that was basically their area of where they would go during the summer. And of course, to the people of Ta'if, well, if we're going to become Muslim and zina is haram, and so is alcohol, well, that takes away a large portion. In fact, perhaps most of what makes in and what brings us the big money, the revenue. And that's going to basically harm our economy. Then we cannot engage in zina. We can't engage in prostitution. We can't engage in basically the drinking, and all the liquor stores are going to be shut down. All those, of course, that area of what makes our place basically a place of hangout is right now. This is changing everything about our economy. So they went to the Prophet ﷺ. And they basically said, well, we'll become Muslim, but we need you to accept, we'll embrace the whole religion. But when it comes to alcohol and zina, we can't let go of that, because that's our money. That's our income. We just can't give up on that. The Prophet ﷺ basically refused. So they wanted at least a certain time until we kind of at least adapt to it. The Prophet ﷺ, just for them to adapt. But then they went farther and they said, well, how about the idols? No, you had to break them. There's no way that we can give you some time to adapt to it. So it was with idols. No, there was only one thing. They were like, well, at least give us like a year until we would go back to our people, kind of, explain the religion to them, and probably, we'll adapt to it and they'll probably grow into this. But the Prophet ﷺ insisted, look at that. The Prophet ﷺ, there was no way. There was no way to compromise the religion in order to somehow think that I'll get more acceptance. I'll get more followers. I'll get somehow people liking what I'm basically saying. And therefore, we're getting more people into the deen by changing the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the Prophet ﷺ, he's a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does not compromise. If you're going to leave the deen, you don't want to follow the deen, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen will not change in order to somehow impress or basically make it intimidating to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen does not change. You have to change to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But don't expect the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change to make it more intimidating, to make it sound and be easier for you. And of course, eventually, of course, they said, okay, well, we'll embrace the religion, but we don't want to be the ones to break the idols. You bring from your own people to come in and break it, because we're afraid that if we would break the idols, that they might actually attack us personally. But if they're coming from you, then I guess you'll have some form of protection, and that way we'll also be safe. Just see that in where the Prophet ﷺ was not compromising the religion whatsoever. Why? Because it's basically going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. In other words, what was basically sent on to you from al-haq. Oh, let's see this one. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. Each one basically had a shir'ah. Each one had basically some revelation in where we could not, of course, follow. And this one was actually perhaps the main ayah for the scholars that said that the previous legislatures are not something that we could get an inspiration from or in any way follow. They basically said, well, here it is, the ayah saying, لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. In other words, they have their legislature. We cannot follow it whatsoever. Islam, we're not talking about the legislature in where the Quran, we know, abrogated for sure this ruling. If the Quran abrogated this ruling, then there's no question about it. But we're talking about, let's bring about an example. Can I ask for a certain position? In other words, let's say I know my qualification, and I would basically go to, let's say, a masjid, or I would go to a certain area and say, hey, these are my qualifications, and I would like to not apply to the job, but I would like to suggest, and here I am, I'm in the interview, I'm basically trying to expose, I guess, my experiences, my expertise, why I'm basically the best person for the job, etc., all of that. Now, according to hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, had basically said, "Man wuliya al-qada faqad dhubiha bighayri sikkin." Whoever is appointed to, of course, here it's talking about al-qada, to be a judge, in where you would be as if you had been slaughtered without a knife. In other words, in where another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, well, we're not going to give that position to someone that seeks it, because if you're seeking it, it basically might actually bring some form of conflict of interest. Then your interest in wanting to keep the job might actually conflict with how the person might actually act in integrity to do the job. That was, of course, that was some of the opinions that scholars had laid out. So does Islam forbid that I would seek a job or that I would present myself looking at my qualifications and actually come in and say, where are my qualifications? So therefore, I would like to seek the job. So scholars actually had differences of opinions on that. Now, remember, there were times where you had Abu Dhar al-Ghifari wanted to be basically in a position of leadership, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "Innaha amana, innaka da'if wa innaha amana." Abu Dhar, you're a weak person. You're not a person that basically has the skill to be in a position of leadership. And this is not an issue of some form of honor, tashrif, but this is actually taklif. This is a responsibility. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ rejected Abu Dhar to be in such a position. But at the same time, there were others where the Prophet ﷺ appointed them. They basically came in and seek to be in a certain position, and he certainly had given them that position. But here's the thing. Can we use the example where Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam said, "Ij'alni ala khaza'in al-ard"? What did Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam say? Well, he basically went to the king and he said, okay, so I interpreted the dream for you, but here's one thing. Now that you recognize that I'm basically a hafiz and I'm alim and I've got the knowledge, you know that I'm basically a person that has some experience and all of that, and you recognize my qualification, therefore, I want you to appoint me as a treasurer. And the king accepts that he becomes the treasurer. Why a treasurer? Well, that was because he had anticipated by interpreting the dream that there was going to be a famine coming and basically inflicting the city for 7 years, or inflicting at least the country, and then they needed to do some form of, let's call it, distribution, in where, because there's going to be a famine coming, so therefore they needed to make sure that there was a fair and, let's say, spread out distribution, in order to, because we're anticipating that there's going to be a coming famine, that we're spreading out our resources in order to have some, of course, available, and that is going to be basically preserved for those coming years. So he wanted to be the person that was overseeing that distribution, and certainly that spread, the way that it spread out, in order to make sure that they had enough resources for those years when the famine would hit and strike that country. So it was in relationship to wanting to make sure that we have, of course, we have those qualifications, in where, one, the person is Amin, the person is basically working with integrity, the person is working with complete trust, somebody that is qualified, somebody that is basically knowledgeable, and that would keep track of all of this. So what did he do? Well, he asked for that position. Is it permissible to ask for the position? This is where they would debate. You see it? Even though you could see the Prophet ﷺ was basically right there, giving that instruction that, no, well, there's a conflict of interest by you seeking a position, but you could say, well, why didn't we say that there was a conflict of interest with Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam? That's where they debated. Is there a conflict of interest? Is there not a conflict of interest? Can we bring about this relationship? Can we get the inspiration from the previous legislatures that we would know of? Okay, we would know of that. In other words, this is not an Israeliyat. This is not some information that we had gotten from the children of Israel, but this is actually something that we were basically informed of in the Quran itself. So when you look at right there is Sharia, in where what it means, the difference between Sharia and is Shari'atu man qablana, etc. Is that part of our own legislature? How do we understand it? You could see in where it is it's important to recognize that we cannot necessarily use the past sharia. Okay, here he said يدل على عدم التعلق بشرائع الأولين. Now, here's one thing. Well, he's Maliki, so he's going to be adopting that idea, but that's not necessarily how others would necessarily see that. So just wanted to note that one. Let's see, number 4. What did he say? أحكام القرآن للكيا. Well, الكيا is Shafi'i. Okay, let's see right there. But is that necessarily how others would get the inspiration? What if we would know that it's, for example, is it, we did the example about Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. Let's do another one. All right, let's do another one. Is it permissible to do the mahr as service? What does that mean? So we know that the mahr for a woman, in where the mahr can be in where, hey, perhaps 250 grams of gold, that's a pretty straightforward mahr. 250 grams of gold, and this woman is basically going to be entitled to the 250 grams of gold, and you have to give them to her as a gift, period. Now, what if he basically said, well, I don't have money, but I have, I guess, some form of service that I could give. So what's the service that you're going to do? He said, well, I'll basically work in her company for, let's say, for what is equivalent to her mahr, perhaps 9 months or 8 years or whatever, basically with no pay. I won't get paid because the amount that it's supposed to be my tuition, I'll basically make that go into paying her.
Oh yeah, like the wife of Musa,
Exactly. That's what we wanted to get to. Like Prophet Musa alayhi salam, in where he didn't have money. So he said, على أن تأجرني ثمانية حجج. What you're going to do is that you're going to be working in service, doing shepherding, basically for 8 years. Can we actually do this service? Let's actually go into a farther one. Can we do a different kind of a service in where we're going to say, well, you're going to get married to this person. And he says, well, I've got the Quran. I can teach her Quran. I'll give her the ijazah. Will that help? Can that work? Can we allow that? Well, scholars actually had differences of opinions. Can we get the inspiration from what Prophet Musa alayhi salam and what of course, that man in Madian had given Prophet Musa alayhi salam to marry his daughter, he was basically putting in a certain service. Can we do that or not? That's also part of that debate. In where can we get that inspiration or not? And of course, some scholars, they basically refuse the whole idea of giving service, whether it's basically, yeah, I'll teach her the Quran and be her tutor, basically. And other scholars, they said, no, they said, sure, that's absolutely fine, because the Prophet ﷺ even said to the Sahabi, I basically married her bima ma'aka min al-Quran, what you had memorized and what you had learned from the Quran. The other scholars, they said, well, if we're going to be having something where we can't necessarily measure, we can't necessarily, in case of dispute, this is where they looked into, especially the Madhab Hanafi. They said, in case of dispute, we're not going to be capable of considering an amount or something that we're going to say in case of dispute. Okay, well, here's what you're going to do. So if, let's say this guy, they went into a dispute, he divorces the lady, and we're going to say, okay, well, how is he going to basically give her the compensation, or at least the assigned mahr? There's no way. What are you going to do? Bima ma'aka min al-Quran. What the Quran that you had memorized. Are we gonna make them become her special tutor even after their divorce? Well, are you serious? They couldn't get along when they were married. How are they going to get along basically after their divorce? We're going to say, okay, we're going to have to work with her, and that becomes another form of basically another form of something where we don't have mal mutaqawwam. What is mal mutaqawwam? In where mal, a certain number of money, something that we could necessarily, I guess, know its borders, know its equivalents, know in how we can make it as something that could be traded and exchanged. So that's why, like al-madhab al-Hanafi, they basically had completely rejected the idea to give this service because it's going to be hard to somehow, I guess, evaluate what that means and how hard he's working and all of that. And is he really taking it seriously? And is she going to be capable of actually getting something in return and all of that? And that's where, just seeing that and seeing, I'm just letting you see the debate right there. It's quite interesting. All right, let's go. So, Sharia, what's the difference between Sharia and al-Minhaj? He said, Sharia is basically the path, in where the clear path that basically reaches us and takes us to survival. Okay, so basically the path that takes us to basically safety. And the Sharia in the Lugha, in Lugha Arabiya, that it was, in other words, linguistically, it basically means the path that we go through, and where, especially a path in where within water. And that's why Sharia is, of course, a path within water. Remember, whether that's why you're talking about Shira is basically the different yachts or the different ships. They're basically having that shara because it's sailing in water. Sailing in water, taking that sailing in water and basically paving the way to a certain path in water. And the Sharia itself, of course, technically, it would be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had legislated for his servants in the religion, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had legislated, and certainly ash-shari'. When we say ash-shari' in the books of fiqh, they would use the word ash-shari', would mean the one that had legislated, which basically is the great path, the revelation, the legislature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. Okay, and the shara in where could also mean in where shira, and where of course shara would basically be what are those in English? When, of course, I could only think of the example in where, of course, they're on the ship, and then the pirate basically orders them to somehow, I don't know why I'm imagining that it has to be a pirate in the story. Okay. Basically orders them to put the anchor down. So that's the anchor. But what about I guess, those flying, what are they called? What are they called? Uh, well, basically what's directing the air, those what are they called in English? I forgot.
Sail,
Somebody,
sail. It's called sail.
was it called?
Sail, S-A-I-L, sail.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's called sail. The part of the
Yeah,
like
the
Sail,
one
isn't that a
like
verb?
a sail ship.
Well,
yeah,
I'm not
sail.
talking about the silk ship. I'm talking about the fabric that is basically, hanging in order to direct the to
Yes,
direct the
it's
ship.
called sail.
Really?
I think to my information, yes, it's called sail. I
Yeah.
can search it.
Okay.
Wait.
Okay. Well, now I guess this is what it is. This is what it is then. So that sail basically right there in where that would be ishira right there. So it comes basically from it, in where it's directing people and in basically a path of water. And certainly the whole idea of Sharia actually comes from that inspiration, in where it's taking into a path in where exactly like water, a path of water, something that is clear, something that is basically going through smooth direction towards guidance. That's basically al-minhaj, okay? Or at least a sharia. Okay, let's continue right there. Yeah, isn't it just so beautiful when you actually look at Sharia in that way? It's like, sailing right there. All right, al-Minhaj. What's the difference between Sharia and Minhaj? So Sharia would basically be, of course, what we were just talking about, and al-Minhaj would more be a systemic path. In other words, it's a systemic way in where it's a paradigm. You're following a certain path right there. Okay, so shur'atan wa minhaja, in where it is basically right there a sunnah, a path, a certain paradigm that you would follow, and a sabil would basically be a direction. Okay, it's a direction. So therefore, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying that the people of Torah, they were basically abiding, or they were supposed to be abiding by a certain legislature. And of course, the people of Injeel, they were abiding by a certain legislature, and certainly Quran was as the final revelation, basically also coming in with a certain legislature, and where it had its own shara'a, basically had its own legislature, and where whether we're speaking about laws of worship, family laws, laws of transaction, laws of basically international law and all of that, but the main thing, al-asl al-tawheed. What is al-asl? Al-asl would basically be the main root. The main foundation is basically tawheed, no differences of opinions in that regard. In other words, there's no abrogation whatsoever in aqidah. There's no abrogation in tawheed. You don't change that because that's a fact about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore it doesn't change. All right. So therefore, when we're talking about a shir'a and al-minhaj, it would be the religion and certainly basically what was revealed onto Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's what abrogated everything that had come before. All right. What we're gonna do, we're gonna stop right there. Should we just at least, let me see, what are we looking at? What time is it? Okay. No, we'll stop right here because we've got some details to go into, but we're still, of course, man, I wish I can just continue. Okay, we'll at least stop right, at least this area, right? Just until here, not too bad. Okay, yeah, we can make you suffer just a little bit more. That's not too bad. Okay, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ ummatan wahida. And if the Lord Almighty would have willed, he would basically have made all the people follow the same legislature. But of course, the Lord Almighty right there had basically, I guess, revealed onto us to let us know that no, previous nations had their own, of course, legislature, and جعل شرائعكم مختلفة ليختبركم, basically had given you different legislatures in order to test you. It was a test. In other words, there were certain things that different nations and different groups and different, of course, previous nations, they were ordered to practice certain things. It was basically suiting their times and not necessarily suiting our times. So فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ أي سَارِعُوا إِلَى الطَّاعَاتِ. So in other words, rush to obedience to the Lord Almighty. How did we get there from point A to point B? So here, فَاسْتَبِقُوا, look at that fa right there. Remember when we said the fa right there, you're going to put a semicolon because it's giving you. So here we go. Here's the fa right there. And look at that. In order for us to see it, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, in where, let's see what فَاسْتَبِقُوا means. فَاسْتَبِقُوا, basically the alif sin ta, remember, basically means to request, and it could also mean in where what you're doing is that you're investing in yourself in order to gain the momentum to be able to do something. That's pretty interesting. You're investing, putting in the effort, gaining in that momentum in order to bring about something really important, which is al-khairat. In other words, you're putting in that effort. And what that really indicates, in where it is indicating that it's important in order to, I guess, rush in doing what is obligatory, and it is important to basically do it as soon as possible. It's like Adan al-Dhuhr, it basically is now rush in doing the good things as soon as possible, because you may not have of course, enough time, enough life to actually do those good things. So the faster you would implement and do what is good, that's basically a sign of basically higher iman. What if I don't have that higher iman? Well, by doing things faster, it will bring you higher iman. Okay. And he said there's no differences of opinions in where to rush doing what is good is basically better than delaying or procrastinating the good things that you would be doing. Whether we're speaking about, of course, different rituals, different rituals, or whether we're talking about other good things. And we're rushing to do the beginning of its time is basically in where it is basically, let's say, precedent, and it basically is better and preferred over rushing it. Okay. Ironically, Abu Hanifa had basically considered that أن الأولى تأخيرها, that it's best to basically delay it. And he said with a generalization in that ayah, so he was basically saying that this ayah was basically giving us a general thing, and where فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, in other words, do what is good and not necessarily do it as soon as possible. Let's say, and he said, and there's an evidence in that ayah that to fast even during travel is preferred over breaking the fast. Let's say, and let's see, إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون. All right. In other words, at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically expose all the different things that they had been disputing all along. In other words, it would become such a fact right before their eyes that one time in life, they were basically disputing whether the Quran was true or not, or they were disputing whether Judgment Day was real or not, or whether heaven was real or not. Well, right now, they're going to be seeing it right before their eyes, and therefore there's no doubt any longer. And that's more of a threat than actually informing them of something. Okay, so tomorrow, hopefully, there is a chance that I might actually go to an appointment for something tomorrow, but so far, I'm not going, but if, inshallah, we continue tomorrow, inshallah, we'll be continuing with Tafsir al-Qurtubi, because we definitely, need to go into those intricate details that we didn't talk about in our previous Tafsir classes. This is it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to listen to them. Everybody is silent. Okay. I guess what I'll do, I will end the recording, and that way I'll give you all the chance to, let's say, what does it do? How do we do this? So we're going to stop the recording and give